Hi everyone, Jaime here at the Gardener Center. Today I'm going to talk to you about orchids and orchid care specifically. So I know there's a lot of you out there that shy away from orchids because I've been in this business for over 20 years, and so many of you will come in, and if you're looking for a flowering plant as a gift or something for your own home, I'll suggest an orchid, and there's a lot of you out there that will say, no. Orchids are too hard to take care of, or I always kill them. So I'm hoping with this video, if you're in that camp, that after this chat you might reconsider them, because I feel like orchids are some of the easiest houseplants in general to take care of inside your home. And as far as flowering plants go, they're the easiest for indoor care. I feel like they just have to have the right conditions. I think where people run into trouble is that they're fussing over them too much, and usually that means overwatering. So we're going to talk about best practices for watering your orchids. We'll talk about where to place them in the home too, because that matters, and we'll chat about when and when not to fertilize. So let's get started. So I think first it helps to talk about how and where orchids grow in their natural environments. Most orchids, I think it's about 70% of them are epiphytes, which epiphyte means it's a plant that grows on another plant, but it's not a parasite, so it doesn't damage the plant that it's hanging out on. It's just like a little hitchhiker, I guess, or a super clingy friend. But they grow on tree barks, and usually in that tropical environment on trees under that canopy of the rainforest canopy there. So there are some orchids that you'll find growing in soil, like around here in this area of the world, you'll see those lady slipper orchids. If you're in a hike in the woods, you'll see those grow in soil, but most orchids do not grow in soil. So they're attached to trees that have like a really deep grooves in their bark, or rough bark, so they can attach easily. There's other epiphytes that you're probably familiar with. Air plants for one. Spanish moss is an epiphyte. It's not really a moss, it's an epiphyte plant. Bromeliads do the same thing. So there's lots of plants out there that do this. But I think that helps to realize that their roots are never in like a saturated soil all the time. They get their water from the rain runoff when it rains in the tropical rainforest like that, so they absorb the water through their roots. And even nutrients, very simply, if some leaves fall, like some debris like that from plant material lands in and around their roots and starts to decay, that's how they get some simple nutrients that way too. So really, I think knowing that helps us understand they don't need a ton of water all the time, that you really want to let them dry out in between your watering, and that's the key. So let's talk about watering here, and I think first I want to address the ice cube issue. There's a lot of folks out there that have been told to water their orchids with ice cubes. I don't know really how that started, other than I think maybe it's started as like a guide to the amount of water to give an orchid, like 1 or 2 ice cubes worth. But we don't suggest watering your orchids that way. One, again, because if you go back to thinking about the way in which, or the areas that they're grown, their tropical locations, they're never exposed to that kind of cold in general. So Danny and I were talking about it the other day. He was like, you hold on to an ice cube in your hand until it melts and see how your skin feels. Same with their roots. They're sensitive roots. They're pretty sensitive plants in terms of temperature. So I just don't suggest it. Again, if it works for you, that's fine. There's that old expression, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Obviously the orchid gods are on your side, so go ahead and do it that way if it works for you. I'm not here to tell you to stop doing something that's working for you. But if you're new to taking care of orchids, we prefer the drench and drain method. We teach you guys to do that with a lot of plants, in fact. But the key with orchids is you want to let them dry out, like I said, in between waterings. They generally come in 2 different kinds of mediums. My growers grow them in sphagnum moss, which will retain water longer than say a bark chip medium would. So in that case, just you got to know which medium your orchids, potted in. If you're getting it as a gift from us, it's probably going to be in one of these grower sleeves that we've decorated and then slipped into a decorative pot, and we put the sheet moss over it and bridge it up nicely. That's going to take a little bit longer to dry out in between waterings than say if you have your orchid planted in a bark chip medium. We sell this in the store. It's bark chip and I think some charcoal and perlite in there. It's very aerated and it will dry out quicker. So, people will often ask, well, how often should I water? And I hesitate to give a firm every 5 days, every 7 days kind of thing, too, because that can vary from your home to someone else's home. It varies based on the time of year. Because for instance, in the winter, the air is really dry. When your hair gets all staticky, it's dry and you've got that forced, hot air blowing in the house. Your soil or your mediums, will dry out quicker than say in the summer when there's lots of humidity in the air. So the best way to do this is to just examine it a little bit. If your orchid is in a grower's pot or in one of these sleeves and slipped into a decorative pot, it's really easy to do this that way. You can just lift it out really quick. Even if there's some of that decorative moss over the top, just lift the whole thing out and examine it a little bit. If it feels really lightweight, that's one clue. Also, just feel in there. And if that sphagnum moss or if that bark chip medium has little to no moisture left, then and only then is it time to water your orchid again, okay? You just don't want to keep the roots consistently wet all the time. Let them dry out. That's the biggest thing. So bring it on over to the sink, run just cool, room temperature water through until you feel like it's gotten, fully drenched in there and there's water coming out of the bottom. Then you want to let it sit in the sink for another minute or two and let it fully drain before you then bring it back and put it in the decorative pot, because you never ever want any of that residual water to drip down into the bottom of the pot, especially one that does not have drainage, and accumulate water in the bottom of the pot. That's the death for most plants. So that's a surefire method. Let it drain fully before you put it back in. If your orchid is potted directly into a decorative container, either in sphagnum moss or in a bark chip medium, the container must have drainage in the bottom. Otherwise, you're asking for it. So, same method though, you would just lift it up off the saucer that it might be sitting on, bring it over to the sink, run water all the way through it so that it's saturated the medium. Let it fully drain before you bring it over back to its home on the saucer or wherever you have it living. So those are the tips for watering, and that's easy, right? That's pretty simple. In terms of where to place them in your home, that matters too. They're especially phalaenopsis like these, a lot of the orchids, their blooms are very delicate. So you don't want to have them sitting next to a really sunny window, one that's getting afternoon beating sun through the window all afternoon. That's true for most plants in general, but interior of a room is better, that has sort of, that's bright enough with natural light during the day that you can read something without needing to flip on a light. It's going to like it there. Also too, don't put them near any type of heating register. I had somebody, they asked why their orchid was dying, and I asked where it was, and they had it set on top of their radiator. So it's too hot. Not near any baseboards or blasting heat, and same goes for your air conditioning vents too. You don't want to be blasting AC on them either. So just an interior room, somewhere sort of neutral like that, they'll thrive. Now, in terms of when to fertilize them and when not to, I suggest you don't worry about fertilizing your orchids while they're in bloom. They've already had enough nutrients up until this point to shoot a spike up and bloom for you. So just enjoy them, water them the way we discussed during their bloom cycle, which lasts quite a long time for orchids, 2-3 months usually. So, and as they go through their bloom cycle, the orchids that are on the lower part of the stem, they opened first. They're going to die off first. So when any blooms from the bottom part of the stem start to look sad, you can just pop them off and enjoy the rest throughout the bloom cycle. And when it's finally done, you want to get a pair of sharp scissors or clippers and cut the stem all the way down to the base, because that stem's never going to bloom again. So you don't need to be sending nutrients up towards it to, because it's not going to bloom again. So just cut it off. That way all your nutrients and water can go to the rest of the plant and get ready to bloom again for you. It does take a little while for another bloom cycle with orchid, but it can be 2, 3, 4, or 5 months. So give it some time. You just want to care for the leaf structure in the plant in the same way that you were, but this is when you can start to introduce a little bit of fertilizer. But I really suggest you go sparingly on the fertilizer. You can use an all-purpose, a balanced fertilizer like a 20-20-20. That's fine. But I suggest you dilute it by half that the instructions tell you on the packaging. They're very sensitive roots. Like I said, they absorb really well, so you can risk burning out the roots with too much fertilizer. So just cut it back, dilute it by half, and it doesn't have to be that often. I'd say once a month, once every 6 weeks, you can water with some fertilizer. In the same way, you would just mix it in a little watering can and water that way over the sink. Same goes for there are products that we sell that encourage another bloom cycle. So this Espomo product, it's a bloom booster made for orchids. Again, I would suggest diluting it a little bit, even from the instructions on the container. So hopefully some of these tips, for those of you in that camp that have been a little leery of getting an orchid, you think they're too hard to take care of, hopefully that convinces you otherwise and you'll give them a try. Thanks for watching, guys, as always, and we'll see you next week.